And when the Bible says there's a time for war, when the Bible says there's a time for war and there's a time for peace, what it's telling us is that you can't mix those two things. You have to know how to make that pivot. And if you're still angling for it to be a time for peace when it's a time for war, you'll end up undermining that important mission. So it is a time for war. So getting back to Psalm 83, and why do we want God to bring shame upon our enemies in addition to defeating them? So there's actually a very deep concept here about shame. Shame is a very powerful emotion. And shame is actually a very important emotion. When Adam and Eve eat from the tree in Genesis, they immediately feel ashamed, right? They cover themselves up, they hide from God. And that's kind of how most human beings feel the first time they commit a sin. Just picture that imagine you've never told a lie. And then the first time you lie, you feel really bad, you feel really ashamed. You ever think about some sin that you might have committed? Don't all call out at once. Think about some sin you might have committed that the first time you did something wrong, you feel really, really bad about it. But as time goes on and you do it again and again, you stop feeling ashamed. What happened to the shame? So, shame, I'm going to give you a spiritual definition of shame. Shame is the measure of the gap between how I see myself and what I've done. I'm going to say it again. Shame is a measure of the gap between how I see myself and what I've done. So going back to our example, if I've never lied before, I'm an honest person. I know I'm an honest person. That's part of my identity. And then but I lied. So there's a big gap between who I am and what I did. So I feel ashamed. But if I start lying over and over again, then I change.
Okay, you're frozen. Okay, you're frozen. We've lost you.
God blamed for things they've done. Because
okay, we just lost you for the last 30 seconds. You froze.
oh, okay. So I'll say
So
what I was
after
saying
you
again.
gave us the definition, yeah.
The definition of shame. So I'll give you, so to go back to our example of lying, if I've never lied before and I'm an honest person and I lie, the reason I feel that shame so strongly is that I'm an honest person, but what I did is I lied, and there's this gap between who I am and what I've done. So I feel shamed. If I lie repeatedly and I become a liar, I'm a less honest person, there's less of a gap between myself, how I see myself, and lying. So when I lie, I don't feel ashamed anymore. And that's why sometimes people feel shame retroactively, like people who find God later on in life and they look back and they feel ashamed for things they've done that they didn't feel ashamed for when they did them, because when they did them there was no gap between how they saw themselves and what they did. But now that they've found God, they look back and say, oh my gosh, I don't want to be a part of that anymore. And they feel the shame. So shame measures a gap between how you see yourself or what you know is true and what you've done, if what you've done deviates from your identity or your values. So when we say that we want our enemies to feel ashamed, it's not because we want to just pile on the punishments on them. It's actually a prayer for souls. What we're saying is we want them to understand the truth. We want them to change the way they think such that when they look at what they've done, they feel ashamed, because right now they don't. Our enemies don't feel ashamed. It's such an appropriate concept for this war. Because think about this. The Nazis in Germany didn't want the world to know about the concentration camps. They kept them a secret and they were discovered, right? Because they knew they were committing a terrible crime. The terrorists, the Hamas savages who brutally murdered and raped and burnt alive all those Jews in Israel on October 7th, not only did they not conceal it, but the reason we've all seen pictures and videos of it is that they shared it themselves on social media. They were proud. There are audios that are circulating. I don't know if any of you have heard them, of terrorists calling their parents from the scene of the crime, proudly saying, Mom, Dad, I killed 10 Jews today. Like some kids call home because hey, I scored the winning touchdown. Hey, I aced my math test. Hey, I killed 10 Jews today. They're proud of what they did. That pride is so sick. So when we pray for our enemies to be ashamed, ironically, just understand, we're actually praying for them to see the truth. As a result of them seeing the truth, our hope and prayer is that they will feel ashamed, meaning that their values will change and they'll recognize what they did was wrong. So this is an important piece of the way we think about war, just spiritually. I'll get into some of the updates and issues. Let's start with the headlines right now, because in terms of what's happening today, we're talking in the last few hours, things that have taken place. So first and foremost, there's been this pressure that we have to be aware of what the landscape is. There's been pressure from the US government, from the Biden administration, pressuring Israel for a ceasefire, or what they're calling a pause, a humanitarian ceasefire. We'll get to humanitarian in a moment. That's an important issue to discuss because it's being thrown around a lot and being misused right now. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Israel has now agreed to some short pauses, 4-hour pauses, but section by section, where there's certain sections of northern Gaza where they will allow short pauses to help the evacuation of civilians from those areas to the south. So very limited. The U.S. is kind of declaring victory that they got Israel to agree to a pause. This pressure from the U.S. government is very unhelpful to Israel. I'll explain why in a moment. But they've agreed to that now of 4 hours a day. But Netanyahu, our prime minister, was very quick to say that these pauses do not mean that the fighting in other areas has stopped. The fighting is ongoing. There's a right now, as we speak, there is a protest taking place in Tel Aviv of the families of hostages who are protesting in front of the Red Cross's headquarters in Israel, because the International Red Cross is part.
Yeah, you're frozen again on us. So you'll have to start with the Red Cross when we get you back.
Criticizing Israel and attacking Israel,
Okay, we
but they've
lost
never.
you. We lost you when the protest in front of the Red Cross.
Okay, so there's a protest in front of the Red Cross by the families of hostages, by the and it's because the Red Cross is not doing their job. Hear me? You can hear me now? Good. The Red Cross is not doing their job but the international community. The Red Cross has a mandate from the United Nations, from the international community, to serve certain roles in wartime. And one of the Red Cross's jobs, you might know this, you guys are combat vets, is to look after prisoners of war, to check in on them, to get information, hostages. They're supposed to look after that. Now, the Red Cross has a history of ignoring Jews and ignoring Israel. When Israeli soldiers in the past have been taken as captives and brought in by Hamas and brought into Gaza, the Red Cross has always ignored their plight and not made efforts to help them. And so we're not so surprised. But unfortunately, that's what's going on now. The Red Cross is not doing their job. They've been in league with Hamas for a long time. So this is something to be aware of, just as a talking point, that right now, as we speak, there's a protest in front of the Red Cross headquarters because the Red Cross is not doing their job on these hostages, hostages in the Gaza Strip. I should also point out, I don't know if I've mentioned this in the past, that all the atrocities that were committed on October 7th, although the scale was enormous, the content of what they did, what Hamas did, is not new. Every single thing they did, whether it's chopping off the heads of babies or killing elderly people or wiping out whole families, burning people, these are all things that they've done repeatedly. But they've done them here and there, one family, one person, a small terrorist attack. But everything Hamas did, they've done before. They just didn't do it to this scale. So And that includes taking hostages. We've dealt with hostage situations with Hamas many times, unfortunately, over the last 20 years. Okay. Now, I want to talk about the humanitarian issue because there's so much talk about this humanitarian thing, and I don't know I'm not sure exactly what we talked about last time, but I want to drill down on this because Israel's getting slammed by the mainstream media for why is Israel so resistant to allowing humanitarian aid in. The United States wanted to send truckloads of humanitarian aid into northern Gaza, and Israel's been refusing. And they're only allowing humanitarian aid into southern Gaza. We'll talk about why that is in a moment. But also, there's been the issue that you might have seen in the media, especially in the early days of the war, where a lot of people were screaming about why is Israel shutting off the water and electricity of the Gaza Strip, if any of you saw that. And I want to explain all of this so that we really understand the humanitarian situation. So first, I'll say something that I may have said last time. I don't remember exactly. And that has to do with, did we talk about, Judy, did we talk about the issue of proportionality in warfare and this charge of Israel being disproportionate in its response?
Right, I think we did.
I think we did talk about it.
We did. I mean, if
Okay.
you want to do a brief overview, because
So
I
I'll
don't know
just
if
I'll just I'll
everyone's
just
here.
quickly review this. And again, I know I'm speaking to people who know a lot more about warfare than I do. But according to international law, this charge against Israel that Israel is being disproportionate in its response that you see in media is really it's a propaganda charge, and I'll explain why. I was in Canada a couple weeks ago, and I was flipping channels, and I see on the news they're saying that, well, 1,400 Jews were killed on October 7th, and they put up some inflated number of how many Palestinian casualties there have been, how many Hamas casualties there have been, thousands and thousands. Even if the number is true, it doesn't change the point I'm about to make. But they showed, and they were talking about how Israel's response has been disproportionate, and they're showing pictures of all the bombed buildings in Gaza, turning these city blocks into rubble, and they're throwing around the term disproportionate. The president of the General Assembly in the UN, Dennis Francis, in the United Nations, also called out Israel for being disproportionate. So just to review a point I might have made last time, but it leads into the humanitarian issue, which I really want to drill down on because this is, I think, one of the biggest narrative information warfare issues that we're facing. According to the Geneva Convention, what is proportional in warfare, and it also is just logic. Once I say it, you'll see that proportionality in warfare is not measured by what your enemy did. It's measured by whether your actions are proportional and appropriate to your military objective. So if you do anything beyond what is proportional to your military objective, that's what makes something disproportionate. It's not they killed 100, so you kill 100. That's ridiculous. That's not proportionality in warfare. That has nothing to do with proportionality. So for example, like if someone's attacking you to try to kill you and I tackle them and wrestle them to the ground and take their weapon away and completely subdue them, and then I take out my gun and shoot them in the head for good measure, that shot to the head is disproportionate because I already subdued the attacker. They're no longer a danger to you, right? So you judge proportionality not by what he was intending to do to you and what I did to him, but by whether or not I've achieved my military objective. So if there's a rocket launcher on a civilian target, on a building with civilians in it, and I fire at that rocket at that building because it's become a military target by the rocket launcher being put on the roof, then that attack on that building is proportionate because it serves my military objective of eliminating that rocket launcher. The fact that there's civilians in the building who weren't evacuated is, according to the Geneva Conventions, 100% the fault of those who put the rocket launcher on a civilian target. They bear responsibility for the civilian casualties. So that's from the legal perspective. So Israel is not being disproportionate, and proportionality is not measured by what the enemy did, by what your military objective is. Israel's military objective is the elimination of Hamas. Hamas puts all of its they launch their attacks from civilian targets so that in the response, civilians will be killed, and then Israel gets demonized for harming civilians. The greatest example of this is that Hamas's main command center, their main command center, is in a tunnel directly underneath Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the largest hospital in Gaza City. They specifically built their command center underneath a hospital to make it more difficult for Israel to attack their command center, because Israel would have to attack a hospital in doing so. Okay, now I'm going to talk about two issues that are actually one issue, you'll see, and that's the issue of the tunnels and the issue of humanitarian aid. Okay, and you'll see how they are actually the same issue. So let me first talk about the tunnels. You've heard about the tunnels in the Gaza Strip. There are underneath the Gaza Strip. Did we talk about the tunnels last time, Judy? No, we didn't. Okay.
Probably not.
Right. Well, we didn't talk about them. Good. So let's talk about the tunnels. You've all heard about the tunnel system under the Gaza Strip. Let me explain it. The Gaza Strip is only about 25 miles long. There is a network of approximately 300 miles of tunnels that Hamas built over the last 20 years under the Gaza Strip. They estimate about 1,500 different tunnels. It's like a spider web. It's an underground city. That's what they did with the billions of dollars in international aid that they got from the United States, from the Europeans, from the International Monetary Fund, from Iran, from Qatar. That's what they do with their billions of dollars. They didn't improve the lives of the civilians. They built a network of tunnels. Some of these tunnels go into Israel and have openings near Israeli settlements, and they were built for infiltration and murder. Some of them in the past have been used that way. But the main purpose of the tunnels is to be this operational center deep underground, which includes their munitions storehouses, and it's where the Hamas fighters live most of the time to stay out of harm's way from drone attacks from the air from Israel. These tunnels are so far underground and so well reinforced that bunker busting bombs cannot touch them. That's how far down they are, hundreds of feet underground. They're not little tunnels like someone digs in a backyard. These are concrete tunnels like subway tunnels. They are air conditioned. They have internet, electricity, running water. They're very sophisticated tunnels. The command centers, the munitions centers are all down there. Now, Israel cannot descend into the tunnels to eliminate these Hamas, because the tactical disadvantage will be so severe. Could you picture, I mean, you guys are all combat vets. Could you imagine sending soldiers down into a tunnel where the enemy is down there waiting for you and knows the tunnel system? It would be a bloodbath. So Israel needs to force these guys above ground where they could easily defeat them. The only way to do that effectively, the quickest way to do that, the most efficient way to do that, is to turn off the water and the electricity to Gaza City, which in a very short amount of time means that they'll have no air down there. They're too far down. There's no natural air down there. They have this ventilation system and air conditioning. If they turn off the water and electricity, it will force the terrorists. They probably have some power sources down there for a period of time. They might have some generators. Who knows what they have down there? But if we turn off the water and electricity, we can force them to come above ground where we can more easily defeat them. And we need to break up the tunnel system. Now, Israel has destroyed a bunch of the tunnels. I'm hearing from my sources that the war, this is not being widely reported this way, but I'm hearing from my sources on the ground that the war is progressing more quickly and more successfully than we even anticipated, which was music to my ears. Apparently, it's going very well. Could the hostages be in the tunnels? They could be. They could be, but let's understand something. We want to free the hostages, and I said this in the past, and we have to understand this. We want to free the hostages, but the military objective of this war is not freeing the hostages. If we turned the whole military objective of this war into freeing the hostages, it would undermine the actual military objective. And you guys know all about that. These are difficult trade-offs to make. Israel is trying to free the hostages, but that's not the primary military objective. But when you see news stories, and this is important for your conversations with people, for your own social media influence with your friends and family around you, When you see people talking about why is Israel shutting off water and electricity, understand that if we don't, we prolong the war. If we don't shut off water and electricity, we allow the terrorists to stay down in the tunnels longer. We allow them to continue their operations down there in their command center. When we shut it off, it forces them above ground. It ends the war more quickly, which means less people will die. So the irony is, let me add one more piece in. We'll get to the irony in a moment. Now, when we talk about humanitarian aid coming into Gaza City, so I stressed to you in my opening remarks about this new pause and where the humanitarian aid is going, that Israel is only allowing humanitarian aid into the southern part of Gaza. Israel, early in the war, set up a safe zone in the southeastern part of the Gaza Strip, which is generally not populated. So they set up a safe zone that's large enough for all the civilians, and they encouraged all civilians to move there, and they held off going in until they could move, and they leafleted and everything. Hamas started they set up roadblocks to prevent civilians from going to the safe zone because they want the civilians to stay in the population centers because it makes Israel's job harder. They serve as human shields. They serve as casualties, which make Israel look bad. Civilian casualties help Hamas. They do this all the time. They even started firing on people, on civilians. Hamas started firing on civilians who were evacuating at some point. Right now, Israel has encircled Gaza City and now controls the roads and is enabling more and more evacuees. Of the approximately 1.2 million citizens of Gaza City and Jabalia in the northern part of Gaza, the main Hamas stronghold, I've heard that between 800 and 900,000 of those civilians have been evacuated to the safe zone. So there's not that many. There's only like 100,000 or so left. The evacuations continue apace. They're continuing to evacuate more and more people. Not a single civilian needs to die in this war. Many have, but not a single civilian needs to. Israel set up this safe zone, and in that safe zone, they're allowing humanitarian aid. They're even providing humanitarian aid. It's controlled by the Israelis, and it's a totally safe area. So all the civilians who remain in Gaza City and Jabalia don't need to be there. They're there because Hamas is keeping them there, and Hamas doesn't allow those civilians to come into the tunnels. The Hamas guys are totally safe. They're underground. When humanitarian aid comes into Gaza, if it goes anywhere other than that southern safe zone that's controlled by the Israelis, it falls into the hands of Hamas. The spokesman for the Pentagon, General Kirby, even said, he admitted in a press conference about a week and a half ago when he was asked about humanitarian aid into Gaza City, he was asked by a reporter, how do you prevent that aid from falling into the hands of Hamas? And he answered, we can't. Which means that humanitarian aid going into Gaza City resupplies the terrorists who are in the tunnels. That's what it does. There's no such thing as humanitarian aid into Gaza City. That means humanitarian aid into Gaza City equals resupplying Hamas. It equals prolonging the war, and it equals more casualties on both sides because of that. So the irony here is that preventing humanitarian aid from going into Gaza, the main population centers in Gaza, and turning off the water and electricity of Gaza are both necessary to expedite the war and prevent more bloodshed that prolonging the war would bring. So the irony is the humanitarian thing to do is to not send humanitarian aid into northern Gaza, and the humanitarian thing to do is to shut off the water and electricity. So next time you hear someone say, oh my gosh, Israel's shutting off the water and electricity, why is that a military objective? Why is that a tactic? Now, Israel is under no obligation to explain every tactic to the world media, but everyone likes to talk. But I'm explaining to you the whole lay of the land so you understand how this all fits together. This is very important information, okay, how this tunnel system works. The tunnel system needs to be destroyed, and Israel is destroying it. I've also heard from my sources that they're making a lot of progress, and they've already destroyed many, many tunnels. So the numbers I was giving you are the numbers at the beginning of the war. Approximately 40,000 Hamas fighters living in the tunnels and about 300 miles of tunnels. That was the state of affairs at the beginning. I don't know what percentage of that has been destroyed at this point, and I don't know how many Hamas fighters have been killed at this point. So those are old numbers, but that gives you a sense of the lay of the land. And again, and as military people with experience, you probably can understand things about what I'm telling you that even I don't understand. But if you picture this, that's the nature of this war. When we talk about destroying Hamas, a big uh, that's a kind of title to the whole war. But if we want to talk about specifics, destroying Hamas, a big piece of that is destroying this city, basically 300 miles, 300 miles of tunnels with the munitions, with the whole infrastructure that's underground. It's going to be a long process, and Hamas is not going to go quietly. So I hope that clarified a number of different issues all at once. Now I see that there's something going on in the chat. Right, someone asked about the hostages. I already answered that about the hostages being in the tunnels. Again, they could be in the tunnels. We don't know. But the hostages, that part of the reason that they have the hostages is, again, to provide shields to prevent Israel from acting more swiftly. So that's all part of the Hamas strategy. Judy, should
Yeah, I
I
guess,
work off the list of questions that I have from last time and answer some that haven't been answered? Would you like me to deal with what you sent me on WhatsApp today?
does anyone have any additional questions? I guess I have a question. The whole hostage negotiation thing. Okay.
Hmm.
The US is talking about getting the American hostages out, and it's being done by Qatar. Okay. But Qatar has all the top Hamas
Okay. So
operatives.
let's
Like,
talk.
yeah.
So let's talk about Qatar. Let's talk. I'm gonna be very frank about where we are right now with the U.S. and with Qatar and with all the different players. And as I always say, as my caveat, what I share with you politically should not reflect on Judy, although it might reflect on Judy. That's up to her. But I'm just going to share with you the lay of the land right now politically. It's a very perilous situation for Israel. The Biden administration is a problem for Israel, plain and simple. It is a problem. We are in a situation, let's go back and review the history of the Biden administration's policies in the Middle East, and then we'll lead up to the current situation with Qatar and the hostages. Okay, so I'm going to frame it. I want you to understand the current involvement of Qatar with the background. During the Trump administration, Israel was getting stronger, and peace was spreading throughout the Middle East. When Donald Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the whole world, the dog that didn't bark, was the fact that there was no negative reaction from the Arab world. For decades, we were told that if the U.S. ever moved its embassy to Jerusalem, which it was required to do by a law that was passed in Congress in 1995, that's how long ago the law was passed, demanding that the U.S. move its embassy to Jerusalem, and every subsequent president was in violation of that law, saying that we can't do it because it'll cause a war in the Middle East. Donald Trump said, let's go ahead and do it. He did it, and there was no war in the Middle East. In fact, the result was the exact opposite. Immediately after the move of the embassy, the Arab nations got the message, and negotiations on the Abraham Accords began. The Abraham Accords were peace deals made, brokered by the Trump administration between Israel and a number of significant Arab states like the United Arab Emirates and Oman and a number of others, including Sudan. A number of other Arab states came on board. They all came on board with the tacit approval, not so tacit approval, but basically this was really a deal with the Saudis, because all of those nations that joined in the Abraham Accords are under the umbrella, so to speak, of the power of the Saudis. And the Saudis have been kind of quiet allies, not unofficial allies of Israel for a long time. And part of their whole calculus was they wanted to have a better relationship with the United States of America. Israel uses Saudi airspace. We have a lot of cooperation with them. The Biden administration, when they came into power, they immediately began undermining the Abraham Accords, actively working to ruin the relationship with Saudi Arabia by embracing Iran, lifting sanctions on Iran, enriching Iran to the tune of tens of billions of dollars by allowing them to sell their oil to European nations again. This allowed the funding of Hamas to begin again because funding for Hamas was cut off because Iran was going broke under the Trump sanctions. So funding for Hamas got ramped up again. They've been trying to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal, which Israel has always maintained is a threat to our national security, but the United States was moving forward anyway, negotiating with Iran. In January of 2022, Joe Biden declared Qatar, quote, and this is exactly what he said, a major non-NATO U.S. ally. A major non-NATO, U.S. strategic ally. Now let's understand something. We're talking about Qatar. Qatar is a regime that openly funds terrorism. They fund Islamic Jihad. They fund Hamas. The second largest funder of Hamas is Qatar. The number one funder of Hamas is Iran. And the Joe Biden administration calls Qatar a major non-NATO strategic ally. Okay? So they're enriching Iran, they're coddling Iran, they're cozying up to Qatar, two vowed enemies of Israel. Qatar was very upset at the other Gulf nations around it for signing the Abraham Accords because they were opposed to the Abraham Accords. They support terror. So if you think about the kingdoms of the Middle East, people talk about Sunni and Shiite. That's a Western. People like to sound smart in the West and divide up the Arab world that way and say that they all hate each other. It's not true. Iran funds Hezbollah, which is Shiite, and Iran is Shiite, and they also fund Hamas, which is Sunni. These lines, it's a nonsense dichotomy. Don't believe it. Okay? Hamas is Sunni, but so are the Saudis, and the Saudis hate Hamas. Okay, so like the Sunni Shiite thing that you might have been told in various briefings over the years about how that's how the Arab world divides up. They do have their disagreements, but it's nonsense geopolitically. It's absolute nonsense. That's not how it shakes out. Okay? For example, Qatar and Iran. Qatar is Sunni, Iran is Shiite. That doesn't change the fact that they're allies. Okay? So get that paradigm out of your heads. Okay? So but geopolitically speaking, you have different camps. You have the camp that supports terror, Qatar, Iran, their proxies in Yemen who just fired rockets at Israel. Today, a rocket hit a lot in Israel that was fired from Yemen. The Houthis in Yemen, who are an Iran proxy, have joined the war. They've started firing at Israel just to open up another front and distract Israel to keep us away from being able to do what we have to do. The Biden administration, in its embrace of Iran and its empowering and enriching of Iran and its embrace of Qatar, has weakened Israel, has strengthened Hamas and Hezbollah, and probably set the stage for this attack to even happen. Okay? At the same time, the U.S. is an ally of Israel. That's official. And they have to play the game of being an ally of Israel. So the Biden administration is kind of playing both sides of this thing. So they put a carrier group in the Mediterranean, and Joe Biden says all the right things about supporting Israel and what they're doing, but behind the scenes, they're undermining Israel and trying to weaken our chances of success. When Joe Biden made his speech a couple days into the war that everyone was lauding as this beautiful, sensitive, pro-Israel speech, what he didn't say was more important than what he said. And he never criticized Iran, who everyone knows is the primary funding source of Hamas. He didn't mention Iran's name even once in that speech, which just tells you everything you need to know. Iran and Qatar, and now Qatar is being brought in as a negotiator for the hostages, as though they're some sort of neutral party, as though they're some sort of enlightened Western nation who are going to help out because they're allies. This is an organization that funds Hamas. It's a terrorist organization. And I'm going to say something very harsh right now. The American people are with Israel. Polling shows that like 80% of Americans are behind Israel, the American people. But because in the US Constitution, the President of the United States has full authority over foreign policy and relationships with foreign nations. The executive branch has full authority over that. There's certain things that have to be ratified by the Senate, but the United States President sets foreign policy. I have to tell you a harsh reality. Over the last couple of days and weeks, by the behavior of the Biden administration, I have to say that the United States is not an ally of Israel. They might be an ally officially, but they're not behaving as an ally at all. They're behaving at best as a middleman, as a neutral middleman, and at worst, they're actually in bed with our enemies, helping them. So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, but their actions have hurt Israel and not helped us, including these calls for a ceasefire. Early on in the war, and Judy might remember this, a couple days into the war, I put out op-eds and videos, and I was saying early on, the Biden administration will pressure Israel to back off. And I got criticized for saying that. People were saying, oh, it's too soon. You shouldn't be criticizing. America's helping us. Why are you bad-mouthing Biden? And now Joe Biden has openly admitted that he's proud, saying that he's pressuring Israel to a ceasefire, pressuring Israel to a pause. And a ceasefire right now is a danger to Israel. It's a danger to Israel for a variety of reasons. One is the impunity that it gives our enemies, that they could do this and not pay the price. It also, the way it works in the Middle East, and I think the political narrative I laid out for you shows it, but we know this, peace through strength is what works. The most peaceful times in Israel's history are the times when we showed strength. And the way it works in the Middle East is if you show weakness, you endanger yourself. And Hezbollah and Iran are watching very closely how Israel behaves vis-a-vis Hamas. They don't want their proxy to be destroyed. And if the Biden administration would have its way, Israel would stop short of wiping out Hamas. And this is a very dangerous time. And again, unfortunately, the Biden administration is not helping. Now, this gets into what you could do to help. Because we need, I received a message 2 days ago from our contacts on Capitol Hill who reached out and said, hey guys, you got a problem. We're getting tons of phone calls demanding statements, insisting on a ceasefire, and your people aren't calling and saying the other side. Because it's a strange thing to call your congressman about. No one thinks to call their congressman to say we don't want a ceasefire, but we kind of need that. So if you guys could call people, let people know, call the Senate, call the Congress, say I laid down my life for my country. I'm a U.S. combat veteran, and I stand with Israel. And I'm telling you, my representative, my senator, that we do not want a ceasefire because a ceasefire hurts Israel because we stand with Israel. If you could make that phone call, it might sound like nothing, but these things matter. They count those calls, and one call in their mind equals what they want to take the temperature of their constituency. So a simple thing you could do to help Israel right now is call your congressman, call your senator, and say I'm opposed to a ceasefire, and I stand with Israel. Yeah. Anyway, so it's a perilous situation, and we need to push back on what the current U.S. administration is doing. Are there any other pressing issues, Judy, that you'd like me to deal with, or I could just pull something off the list here? Someone asked a question, Judy. You sent this to me about like, what about the day after? Like what happens long term to the Gaza Strip? Like what's the plan going forward? So you'll hear a lot of talk in the coming days. You'll hear a lot of talk in the coming days about the U.S. administration is always pushing for what we call for the two-state solution, that there should be a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state. Now, October 7th showed us already that we have a problem with a Palestinian state that's armed. It's certainly because what are you going to do? If you set up a democratic Palestinian state and they elect Hamas, then you have a problem, because let's remember, Hamas took power by being democratically elected. So Israel, where we are right now, from the Israeli perspective, Israel's not involved in negotiations about the day after yet, but I'm telling you what's going to be said. Okay, so you're not going to hear this yet. No Israeli, the Israeli government hasn't said this is what we want after the war. They're not saying that because it's not time for that yet. But there's going to be a fight coming down the road where the Biden administration and the international apparatus is going to be pressuring Israel to allow the Palestinian Authority to increase its power in the area and move to a two-state solution. They might even talk about American peacekeepers there. Israel will not go for that. Israel does not allow other armies to put boots on the ground and get in harm's way. We take care of our own security. But there's going to be a push for this two-state solution. Understand that Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of the Palestinian Authority, he's more moderate than Hamas, but he still is someone who pays the families of terrorists if they're successful in killing Israelis or tourists in Israel, like the American combat vet Taylor Force, who was in Israel and was killed by a terrorist, and his family and the family of the terrorist who killed Taylor Force continues to get a stipend from the Palestinian Authority with your tax dollars to this day. And there's a law on the books in the US that was passed during the Trump administration. Donald Trump signed it into law, passed both houses, called the Taylor Force Act, which prohibits the US government from giving aid to the Palestinian authorities so long as it continues to pay the families of terrorists. We call it the Pay for Slay program. That's what they do there. During the Trump administration, they cut off funding to the Palestinian Authority because they were paying terrorist families, and lo and behold, terrorism in Israel got down to its lowest levels in Israel's history. During the last 2 years of the Trump administration, there were less Israelis died from terrorist incidents than in any 2 years in the history of the state of Israel. As soon as the Biden administration came into power, they announced that they would violate the Taylor Force Act. They didn't say it in those words. They said they're going to restart funding to the Palestinian Authority with no strings attached, which means we're going to ignore the Taylor Force Act. And lo and behold, terrorism was on the rise year over year even before the Hamas attacks. So we have a big problem. I'm sorry that the theme of this call is very political, but that's where we are right now. The Biden administration is an adversary of Israel, and it's an adversary of the Jewish people right now. And the Jewish community is slowly waking up to that. But what they're going to be doing downrange in the next few weeks and months, they're going to be pressuring Israel to accept some sort of Palestinian state. Israel's position will be changed from what it's been in the past. In the past, Israel was always willing to accept a Palestinian state with certain parameters and with recognition of the state of Israel. But the Palestinians have always rejected it. But Israel's position is not going to be that anymore. What you're going to see is that Israel's position will be, we're all for the Palestinians governing themselves. We certainly have no interest in governing them, but there will be zero armed presence between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean that is not Israeli. We cannot, after October 7th, we cannot ever again allow anyone other than the Israeli security forces to be responsible for the security of Israeli citizens. And if we allow a Palestinian entity between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean that has guns, then there's no chance of that. Now, also, there's going to be an effort to make, as I said, to get the Palestinian Authority, which is supposedly more moderate, to be the governing control. But the Palestinian Authority has no backing of the Palestinian Arabs. It is a beautiful fiction that we all like, a beautiful lie that we all like to tell, is that the Palestinian people want peace, but they have corrupt leaders like Hamas above them who are oppressing them. I wish that were true. All polling shows, and a lot of reliable polling too, from American entities on polling Palestinians who aren't living under Hamas in other territories, but all the polling shows that Hamas is wildly popular among Palestinians. In fact, the Palestinian Authority has not had elections in about 18 years, even though they're supposed to have elections every 4 years. And the reason they haven't had elections is that the last time they had an election for the legislature, Hamas won the majority in all territories, not just the Gaza Strip. Hamas won the majority of the Palestinian legislature. And everyone knows that Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, would lose an election to a Hamas opponent if there was an election held at any point in the near future. So after the destruction of Hamas, the world, the Americans, the State Department, the CIA, the world, they're going to try to resuscitate the Palestinian Authority and claim that they represent the Palestinian people and force this on Israel. And at that point, there's going to be a battle. Another information war about who the Palestinian Authority is and what Israel's needs are in terms of security. So we have some battles ahead of us. Obviously, the first and most important thing is to win the war. But what's going to happen the day after? I don't know. I've been asked in a number of interviews recently, what's the plan for afterwards? Or how do you change the fact that you have a whole population that's been raised from their mother's milk to believe that murdering Jews is a sacred act? And how do you change a society of hate? And I always say to them, look, you can change a society that's hateful. But unfortunately, the way it works is you can only change them by absolutely defeating them. And my two examples, and with this I'll end, and I think we'll end the call. I'm going to have to hit the road. My two examples are Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And this is good for if you're sitting around having a beer discussing what's going on in the Middle East. This is a good talking point to share with people. Because people say, well, what are you going to do about these people? How are you going to solve the problem? What happens even if you destroy Hamas? Then you still have a hostile population. Both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, their populations were by and large on board with their evil regimes. The Japanese in Imperial, in the Pacific Theater, when Imperial Japan was ravaging all the other Eastern nations and committing all sorts of atrocities and mass murder in World War II, the Japanese people were behind their army. They were patriotic. They loved Hirohito. They weren't being oppressed by their own government. They were all for it. So why did Japan change? Why are Japanese people today peaceful and somewhat Western in their thinking? Why are they not murderous and genocidal the way Imperial Japan was? How come the German people today are generally benign and peaceful people who don't want genocide anymore? The answer is that they got roundly defeated. Evil regimes can't be just tamped down. They need to be completely defeated, and only then do their populations get a wake-up call and have any hope of changing. And the same thing's going to happen here. We've been pussyfooting these jihadists for way too long, and playing nice with them and pretending that that they're not the problem they are. The Muslim Brotherhood created Hamas. They're an evil terrorist organization. And we need to give these people a taste of real defeat and only once they feel actually defeated is there any chance that they're going to change the way they think. But at the same time, that's not ultimately Israel's responsibility is to protect Israel and to protect our citizens. That is our responsibility. And what the day after looks like for the Gazan people who elected Hamas, for the Gazan people who cheered them when the savages came back into Gaza City after raping and murdering Jews and killing babies, they were met with cheering crowds of thousands of people who were celebrating what they did. So these people are obviously brainwashed into this terrible, evil Islamic jihadist ideology. What it's going to take to change them, I don't know. But at the same and we'll try, but it really isn't our responsibility or our concern. I hope that doesn't sound too harsh, but that's the facts, folks. We got attacked and we have to defend ourselves. So I hope I've given you more clarity for what's going on now. And Judy, we're going to cut this off. We'll do it again next week. I'll be back home for a few weeks. I'm coming back to the States again in December, but let's resume next week. And fire away, send questions into Judy. Also on the videos you guys have been making. So my video guy just sent me last night a whole bunch of them edited up and put on with Hebrew subtitles. And this week we're going to start pushing them out into the Israeli social media so that and to the social media that soldiers see, so that your messages of support, the heroes to heroes messages of support, are going to start hitting the media waves soon. We haven't released them yet because we wanted to edit them all up, and I want to show them to Judy first so that Judy approves them before they go out as well. So Judy, you'll be getting those from me soon also. I just got the whole tranche of them from my video editor last night.
Okay,
All right,
great.
guys, I got to go.
All right,
Thank you very
thank
much.
you. Have a safe flight home, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Two things, heroes. Number one, get me your questions for next week. Yeah, Rabbi, go do get to the airport. And number two, if you still haven't signed up for the Power of Together, fighting Hamas and hatred online on social media contest, just send me an email. That's all you need to do to sign up for that. Me, Omar, or Kayla, and we're all set. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your concern, and I appreciate all the notes and everyone. You've all been wonderful. Thank you. All right, have a good week.